Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 20, The Fallout of the Revolution, the Founding Fathers, and the Treaty of Six Nations. And we encapsulate history into neat little categories, talking points, or bullet points on a PowerPoint presentation. We tend to lose the mess that is history itself. As you've heard already, the United States Constitution was not the original framework that our country put together. The Articles of Confederation were noble, but were eventually deemed imperfect within the lens of history. One can argue that it is just semantics, but at the end of the day, the Articles were scrapped to make way for the Constitution as we know it. It's important to know that history is messy, complicated, and often wrong. And what is accepted as a social norm today might eventually become taboo in a future time. It was only a short 2 generations before me where it would have been illegal to be married to my wife, who is of Asian descent. If I ever end up writing a book, I think the title will be Mistakes Were Made, The Story of America. Fallout from the American Revolution. What happened right after the Revolutionary War ended? It's easy to think the United States of America was born immediately after the British surrendered at Yorktown. In truth, it was a long, arduous process to transform the ideological emergent state into a fully formed nation. Only after many years of challenging diplomatic talks was a peace treaty with Great Britain established. It also took a long time for British soldiers to leave American soil, taking loyalists and slaves back to England. The real work began after the British left, however. History rarely plays out quickly for anyone. With much toil and debate, the United States Constitution was written after the country spent years languishing in economic hardship. Rebellions, disorganized states, and an ineffective Continental Congress threatened to destroy the grand experiment that was America. Luckily, this country managed to get its act together and write the Constitution that we're using still today. However, it was undoubtedly a winding, complicated road to get there. It's easy to think that when the Revolution was raging in the colonies, most, if not all, Americans were in support of rebelling against the Crown. The truth is, around 15 to 20% of the American colonists were still loyal to the Crown and were unhappy when the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781. Some of these loyalists were beaten up by gangs of patriots who came to their houses to punish them for backing the other side. While several people had the luxury of keeping silent about their politics, those living on the front lines often had to pick a faction and stick with it. Therefore, when the British started pulling out of the states, many loyalists left with them. The year after the British surrendered at Yorktown, the first Prime Minister of Britain, Lord North, resigned in disgrace. Before the conflict ended, he tried to end it through diplomacy with a conciliation plan. It said that the British would stop any oppression if the colonies ended the rebellion. The settlements, however, continued to fight. By the time the American Revolution ended, North was exhausted by the tension between the two countries and couldn't handle the position anymore. It took a while for the British to leave the colonies after their surrender entirely. On July 11, 1782, British Royal Governor Sir James Wright and military personnel fled Georgia to South Carolina. The goal was to evacuate the colonies via the ocean. Several ships sailed from New York, while others went to Florida and the West Indies. Wright eventually returned to London and perished there 3 years later. Though the British surrendered at Yorktown, the conflict was technically not over for some time. Peace talks began the following year in 1782 in Paris. Richard Oswald negotiated for the British, while Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams represented America. Eventually, the Articles of Peace were signed, which became the basis for the formal treaty several years later. The agreement set up by John Jay, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Richard Oswald brought both America and Britain closer to the conflict's conclusion. In 1783, the Continental Congress officially ratified a preliminary version of the treaty. This allowed them to take a more fleshed-out version of the treaty to Paris, where representatives from the United States, Great Britain, Spain, and France all gathered. The document that finally led to the formal end of the revolution, the actual Treaty of Paris, was a product of many months of negotiation and politics. As a result of the treaty's final iteration, England recognized America as an independent nation. American anglers were allowed to fish in Canadian waters, and England had to hand over territory between the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River. America also agreed not to persecute loyalists or block creditors who had debts to collect and restore property taken during the conflict. The last British soldiers departed from New York in November 1783. The soldiers were left with thousands of loyalists and former slaves. The event became a holiday known as Evacuation Day. When the soldiers left, they nailed their flag to a pole and greased it so that it would be hard to remove. For years afterward, on each anniversary of the event, an American citizen would reenact the daring climb of John Van Arsdale, a sailor. The latter scaled the pole and replaced the British flag with an American one. 1 month after the last British troops left the country, George Washington resigned as commander of the U.S. armies in Annapolis, Maryland. It was seen as a patriotic act that showed his commitment to the government over his desire for personal power. After resigning, he went back home to his plantation in Mount Vernon, Virginia. That is, of course, until duty called once again during the country's first presidential election. An economic crisis swept through Massachusetts in the 1780s, forcing many farmers into intense debt. The state didn't forgive their debt, and many farmers lost their property or were thrown in jail. Naturally, this meant that people were outraged and upset. As rage continued to instigate, the citizens took up arms against the government. The governor of Massachusetts, James Bowdoin, assembled his military force and crushed the rebellion. Siding against the rebels cost the governor, as he was severely defeated in the next election. The initial document outlining American society created in 1777, the Articles of Confederation, needed a revision after America won independence and become a functioning nation. The original articles did not have any power to effect change or regulate government. It couldn't even tax the people. A new country needed a constitution, so delegates were called to Philadelphia in 1786 to craft a new document. Over several months, representatives presented different plans for the federal government. Delegates reached compromises. After a signing ceremony on September 17th, the United States Constitution was finished. It took several years for the states to ratify the Constitution. The first 5, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut, quickly confirmed the document. However, several other states had misgivings about the document because it failed to protect fundamental human rights such as freedom of speech and religion. Therefore, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were added to the document. In 1789, America held its first presidential election. The rules were a little different from today. Only white male property owners were allowed to vote, and the man with the second most votes will become vice president. George Washington won the election and was sworn into office on April 30th, 1789. The Founding Fathers. Who were the Founding Fathers? They were some of the most influential people in American history, and almost all of them were more morally questionable than most people gather. And while we often look back at the American Revolution through rose-colored glasses, the truth is that these men weren't always so noble. It's not easy creating a nation from scratch, and nothing proves it quite like the dark American history surrounding these Founding Fathers. The phrase, skeletons in the closet, takes on a very literal meaning about Benjamin Franklin. In 1998, renovators working on Franklin's London home uncovered 1,200 pieces of human bone. The pieces came from different parts of the body and from about 15 specimens, 6 of whom were children. Experts say it's far more likely the Founding Fathers assisted in underground anatomy school by helping sneak bodies from the graveyard and gallows. Back in the day, studying bodies was considered morally reprehensible, and early pioneers in the field often had to require them in secret to do their studies. George Washington, who inherited ownership of his first enslaved person at the age of 10, used legal loopholes to keep people enslaved throughout his life, even as abolition took a hold throughout the North. While living in Pennsylvania, he found a way to get a hold of the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, which states any enslaved person who lived in the state of Pennsylvania for more than 6 months was free. Washington would secretly send enslaved people on trips outside state borders every 6 months to constantly reset the clock and ensure they would not be legally free. Washington stands as one of the most famous and recognizable American figures, but few realize the issues he faced regarding his dental health. As Washington grew older, all of his dental problems began to change the shape of his face. While he did have dentures, they were not made of wood as most believe, but different combinations of lead, brass, gold, ivory, wire, screws, and even some teeth of black Americans. Deep in one of Washington's account books is an entry that shows him buying 9 teeth from them for 122 shillings. A modern-day American averaged about 2 gallons of alcohol per year. Back then, your average colonist guzzled 7 gallons per year and was a few beers into the day by lunch. Several theories attempt to explain the Founding Fathers' extreme penchant for alcohol, other than the starting a country is stressful business. These theories range from the scarcity of clean water to widespread belief that water was bad for you to the idea that only poor people drank water. As the oldest signer of the Declaration of Independence, 65-year-old Honest John Hart faced exceedingly terrible consequences for his patriotism. In 1776, he began to lose everything. Within months of signing the Declaration, his wife of 36 years passed while British forces forced him and his 13 children from their New Jersey home. He sent the youngest children to live with neighbors. According to legend, Hart spent a long time hiding from the British by living in caves, open fields, and the forest. As this older man toiled in the elements, the British looted his property, slew all his livestock, and partially destroyed his home. In 1793, yellow fever swept the city of Philadelphia, taking out thousands of people. Though the city's doctors ranked among the best in the world, they lacked the knowledge of how to treat the disease or prevent its contraction. Signer of the Declaration of Independence, Dr. Benjamin Rush, among the most respected medical pioneers of his day, believed purging the body through bloodletting and forced vomiting would cure patients. As it turns out, these fluid-based treatments failed to help patients. If anything, they made their situation even worse. His peers harshly criticized his efforts, and to this day, historians still debate whether or not he qualifies as a hero or villain of the Philadelphia story. Despite a large community of physicians openly critiquing his practices, Dr. Rush wouldn't stop bleeding his sick patients and forcing them to vomit. Thomas Paine, who we've mentioned before, is the founding father famous for his pamphlet Common Sense. He passed in 1809. Less than 10 people attended the funeral of the once famous Paine, who lost popularity for opposing the church. Next to broke at the end of his life, Paine was buried in a modest grave on his farm with his burial request ignored. 10 years later, William Cobbett dug up Paine's remains to take him back to London for more respectful burial, but this bit of grave robbing backfired. Paine's remains ended up being passed down to Cobbett's relatives, who sold them off piece by piece. While devotees of Paine routinely attempted to give him a proper burial in New York, finding all the pieces of his body remains an impossible task. Today, they say Paine's head lies in Australia and the rest of his body is at the four corners of the world. John Adams came into office having to fill some big shoes. The shadow of George Washington, famous and beloved across the country, made adapting to the White House even harder for the way less charming Adams. His political ideas did him in from the very beginning. As vice president under George Washington, he suggested the president should be referred to as His Highness, the President of the United States of America, protector of the rights of the same. Indeed, an interesting title choice for the leader of a country that actively resisted monarchy. Furthermore, John Adams remains one of the few presidents only to serve one term. His administration created some of the least popular legislation of all time, including the Alien and Sedition Acts that illegally criticized the government. A whole country of people who just escaped one egotistical monarch felt a little love for someone who fashioned himself as the same. Judge George Wythe, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, ended his life dishonorably, poisoned by his grandnephew after threatening to cut him out of his will. Minutes after a person Wythe had enslaved poured coffee for herself, Wythe and his 16-year-old protege, Michael Brown, they all had developed horrifying stomach pains. Wythe passed within days, though the enslaved person, Lydia Broadnax, claimed that she saw his grandnephew throw a piece of paper into the coffee pot before serving it. Virginia law prevented black people from testifying against white people in court, so he was ultimately acquitted. By signing the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers risked their lives, and for many, this risk failed to pay off. This risk cost New Jersey signer and Continental Congress member Richard Stockton everything. While he succeeded in moving his family to safety, he was captured when the British invaded New Jersey. The British imprisoned Stockton for years in terrible conditions before moving him to the Provost prison in New York. At Provost, he starved and was forced to endure freezing winter temperatures for over a month. This ruined Stockton's health, and when he was finally released on parole, he returned to find his estate ransacked and his library, one of the nation's finest, burned. While conflicting accounts exist over whether George Washington was particularly sadistic or a kind slave owner, most historical reports show he frequently utilized harsh punishments against the enslaved people. Though corporal punishment of enslaved people through whippings, beatings, and overworking was common throughout the South, records show Washington utilized exceedingly terrible punishment. The fame surrounding Patrick Henry, who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," managed to eclipse the tragic decline of his wife Sarah and how Patrick treated her. Patrick and Sarah lived in an ideal marriage until she became afflicted with what scholars think was postpartum depression. After the birth of the first sixth child, she withdrew from her family and began an aggressive and unpredictable downward spiral into sanity, allegedly even trying to drown one of her children. During our Founding Fathers' time, many considered mental illness a sign of evil, and few knew how to take care of the mentally ill. Most available care typically revolved around imprisonment or torture. To protect his wife from this fate and possibly even his reputation, Patrick Henry kept Sarah locked in their basement in a makeshift straitjacket for years under constant supervision. She lived that way for 4 years before her passing. It's thought that she took her own life. Gouverneur Morris. "We the people of the United States" is perhaps the most famous phrase in the Constitution, and it was penned by one of the most mysterious founding fathers. Gouverneur Morris, born in the Bronx and spent many years in Europe, might not top the list of most famous founding fathers, but he was definitely one of the wildest of the bunch. Morris didn't marry until he was 57. During his bachelor years, he had quite a few romantic escapades, one of which cost him his leg. In an adventure in France, Morris carried on an extended affair with a married woman who lived in the Louvre. Before it became home to the Mona Lisa, the Louvre was a palace for the French king, and Morris's friend also happened to live there. Morris recorded their love affair in his diary using the word "celebrating" as code for sex. If his diary is any indication, the two liked to take risks. One of the diary entries described the pair having sex in the hallway with the doors open. For years, Morris never settled down, preferring instead to spend his time romanticizing married women. And he shocked the world when he married his housekeeper at the age of 57. At a Christmas party in 1809, Morris announced his marriage to Anne Gary Randolph, 22 years his age. Anne, known as Nancy, had a reputation dating back to 1792, where she was accused of adultery and murder. Nancy, just 17 at the time, reportedly slept with her brother-in-law. The illicit union produced a baby who died shortly after birth. Nancy was tried for murder, though she insisted the baby had been a stillborn. She was eventually acquitted. On the day he married Nancy, Morris wrote in his diary, "I marry this day Anne Gary Randolph. No small surprise to my guests." Morris lost his leg at the age of 32 after being hit by a carriage. But what sounds like a simple accident goes much deeper. The incident happened in Philadelphia at the intersection of Logan's Alley and Dock Street. Morris, a reputed ladies' man, found himself in hot water after a furious husband learned the founding father was sleeping with his wife. Morris was running from the scorned husband when a carriage ran over his leg. Unfortunately, it had to be amputated. After the accident, one of Morris's friends optimistically hoped that the new peg leg might help Morris avoid the, quote, pleasures and dissipations of life into which young men are too apt to be led, end quote. In response, Morris quipped, quote, "You argue the matter so handsomely and point out so clearly the advantages of being without legs that I am almost tempted to part with the other," end quote. Having a peg leg didn't slow Morris down. His friends and fellow founding father, John Jay, told Morris that he wished his friend had lost something else. For years, Morris kept seducing married women, and even after it cost him a limb. And during his time in France, Morris used his wooden leg to chase off a mob of revolutionaries. Morris rode in an ornate carriage when an anti-aristocratic mob descended on him. Morris pulled off his leg and shouted out the window, shouting, "Vive la Révolution!" The sight distracted the revolutionaries long enough for Morris to speed off in his carriage. Morris acquired some bizarre objects during his time as a diplomat. His tenure as a U.S. minister to France coincided with the most tumultuous period of the French Revolution. As an eyewitness to the Reign of Terror, Morris strongly opposed the revolution, ironically siding with the monarchy. He even attempted to rescue Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from the revolutionaries who would later execute them. Perhaps to remember his time in France, Morris bought Antoinette's furniture. The elaborate set, which included an intricately decorated armchair, originally resided at Versailles. During the French Revolution, Morris purchased the entire collection and shipped it to the Bronx. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. Morris became one of the most important members of the Constitutional Convention, giving more speeches than any other delegate, 173 to be exact. Morris promoted a strong presidency with veto power, as well as an elitist Senate. He also strongly opposed slavery. Morris was responsible for polishing the final draft of the Constitution, and in doing so created the document's most important line. The original draft read, "We, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, do ordain, declare, and establish the following Constitution for the government of ourselves and to our posterity." Morris changed it to the much more concise, "We, the people of the United States." The Declaration of Independence famously stated, "All men are created equal." However, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned nearly 1,000 slaves in total. In sharp contrast, Morris strongly opposed slavery. During the Constitutional Convention, Morris called slavery a nefarious institution. He harshly condemned the practice, saying, "Proceed southwardly, and every step you take through the great regions of slaves presents a desert increasing with the increasing proportion of these wretched beings." Morris grew up in the Bronx, which is a rural farmland to his day. As an adult, he played a central role in shaping the state of New York by promoting the Erie Canal. He also forever left his stamp on New York City by reforming Manhattan's city plan. In 1807, Morris was appointed to a commission charged with crafting a master plan for the growing city's layout. In 1811, the commission produced a grid system for the city with 155 streets and 12 avenues, rejecting the circles and ovals that dominated European cities. The planners eschewed European-style plazas that created irregular building lots. Instead, Manhattan would have a city of right-angle houses, cheap to build and convenient to live in. To make the massive change, the city had to tear down nearly 39% of pre-grid buildings because they were in the middle of a new street. The Bronx neighborhood of Morrisania traces its history back to the 1670s when the Morris family bought 500 acres of land along the Harlem River. When Gouverneur Morris was born on the ground in 1752, by the point encompassing some 2,000 acres, it was home mainly to small farms and dairy cattle, until Morris built an enormous mansion for himself. The Morris clan even offered the family estate the Continental Congress as a potential site for America's new capital city. However, the neighborhood still contains St. Anne's Church, where Morris is buried. Gouverneur Morris wasn't the only Morris who witnessed the founding of the country. His half-brother, Lewis Morris, also signed the Declaration of Independence. His financier friend, Robert Morris, who was not directly related to Governor, also penned the name of the document. After the war, Governor and Robert collaborated to establish America's financial security. Robert Morris acted as superintendent of finance during the Revolutionary War, almost single-handedly keeping the war effort afloat. But Robert faced a significant downfall of his own. While Governor was serving in the U.S. Senate, Robert lost much of his money speculating on land and died near poverty. During the American Revolution, Morris worked for the New York Revolutionary Government and later served in the Continental Congress as one of its youngest members. Morris became close with George Washington, as many other founding fathers did. Morris, who kept a detailed diary and recorded many details about his life in letters, served in multiple committees during the Continental Congress. He wrote that he did much of the work on every committee he served. Morris was a strong supporter of George Washington, and the two remained close for decades. Later, Morris played a central role in the Constitutional Convention. He was instrumental in shaping the Constitution that has governed America for centuries. Later in life, Morris experienced a blockage in his urethra that gave him trouble urinating. Today, scholars probably would have said that it was prostate cancer. The crafty founding father attempted to treat the blockage by sticking a piece of whalebone up his urethra. In the process, he caused a great deal of damage that ultimately contributed to his death. Days after he died, a Boston newspaper reported that Morrison died from, quote, a short but distressing illness. Treaty of the Six Nations of 1784. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix was a treaty finalized on October 22, 1784, between the United States and Native Americans from the Iroquois League's Six Nations. It was signed at Fort Stanwix in present-day Rome, New York. It was the first of several treaties between Native Americans and the United States after the American victory of the Revolutionary War. Following the war, the British ceded their North American claims to the American government against their Native American allies' desire. As a result, the status of Indian lands was ignored in the Treaty of Paris, which was the peace and land settlement between the British and American colonies. Iroquois League fled to Canada after the Revolution to continue receiving British support. Later, some of the Iroquois returned to their home in the Ohio region. Those that returned often got into violent conflict with colonists trying to settle the area. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix was intended to serve as a peace treaty between the Americans and the Iroquois and certain other Indian lands farther west, which the Iroquois had gained by conquest during the Beaver Wars last century. Joseph Brant was a leading Indian at the start of negotiations. Brant had to leave early for a planned trip to England. The top Indian representatives who signed the treaty were Corn Planter and Captain Aaron Hill. In this treaty, the Iroquois Confederacy ceded all claims to the Ohio Territory, a strip of land along the Niagara River, and the land west of Buffalo Creek's mouth. In Pennsylvania, the land acquired its treaty is known as the Last Purchase. The Six Nations Council at Buffalo Creek refused to ratify the treaty, denying that their delegates had the power to give away such large tracts of land and asked the Americans to return the deeds and promise to repay them for any presents they had given. The General Indian Confederacy also disavowed the treaty because most of the Six Nations did not live in the Ohio Territory. The Ohio Country natives, including the Shawnee Indians, the Mingo Indians, the Delaware Indians, and several other tribes, rejected the treaty. A series of treaties and land sales with these tribes soon followed. Without a doubt, the treaty was controversial. Locally, the Oneida and Sir William Johnson disagree about whether the boundary line started on the east or west end of the Oneida carrying place that Fort Stanwix protected during the French and Indian War. If the line began on the east end, then the Oneida controlled the carry. If on the west end, the carry was controlled by British and its New York colony. In the bigger picture, the Board of Trade was concerned about starting a renewed conflict between the American Indian nations. Stewart also complained about the Fort Stanwix boundary line, which negatively impacted his relationship with the Cherokee, and called into question the line negotiated in the Treaty of Hard Labor. The Board of Trade and General Jeffrey Amherst chided Johnson and ordered him to renegotiate the line to end at the Ohio-Kanawha River's confluence. Johnson refused. This treaty's legacy is that although relations between colonial settlers, land speculators, and officials, the American Indian nations remained strained. There was less conflict in the West, permitting colonial settlers and land speculators to surge westward. This treaty opened up lands that would eventually become part of western Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, northeast Tennessee, and future states of Kentucky, West Virginia, which ceded from Virginia during the American Civil War. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix was a significant blow to the Iroquois League. The Revolutionary War had significantly weakened the Confederacy's strength, and negotiations at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix served to divide them further. After the war, the Iroquois never returned to their former influential status. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.